a gerotype, was delivered to the Boston Medical Society on March 15, 1862. It was wrapped in plain brown paper and carried no return address. Inside was a haunting photograph, a pale young man resting peacefully in a coffin, his eyes shut, his hands arranged across his chest in the conventional posture of Victorian death portraiture. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary about this memorial picture. That was until Dr. Samuel Hayes observed something that sent a chill down his spine. Etched lightly into the photograph's silvered surface were faint, barely perceptible marks. They were tiny lines that looked like the scratches of fingernails, as though someone had been frantically clawing at the picture from the other side. The note that came with it was short. Thomas Copeland died February 28, 1861. Millbrook, Massachusetts. May God forgive what I have done. It was signed by Dr. Frederick Copeland, a once well-regarded doctor who had disappeared from his practice 6 months before, leaving behind nothing but rumors of bizarre experiments and the unexplained death of his brother. Before we go deeper into the story of the Copeland brothers and reveal the terrifying reality behind this image, we need you to become part of our community of mystery enthusiasts. Press that subscribe button and tell us in the comments which state you're joining us from today. We really enjoy building connections with other fans of dark history from all over America. The enigma of Frederick Copeland would stay hidden within the Medical Society's records for more than 100 years, until a remodeling project in the building in 1963 revealed a concealed space. This hidden compartment held thorough medical diaries, personal letters, and, most alarming of all, a set of comparable photographs, each one displaying the same characteristic scratch marks. Millbrook, Massachusetts, in the year 1861, was a community suspended between two eras. Situated in the gentle hills 30 miles west of Boston, it held onto the serene appeal of rural New England, while gradually changing with the Industrial Revolution transforming the country. Its nearly 800 residents mostly earned their living from textile mills driven by the fast-moving waters of the Millbrook River. Although agriculture and timber were still crucial to the area's prosperity, the town's solitary main street was bordered by white clapboard houses, their dark shutters and stone bases reflecting the no-nonsense Puritan legacy of those who constructed them. The Civil War had stretched its long shadow over Millbrook, just as it had over the whole nation. Young men who had never traveled further than the next county now found themselves marching toward the south to meet an unknown destiny, leaving behind worried families and a town fighting to keep its sense of everyday life. It was against this setting of national turmoil that the Copeland family had become established as central figures in the community. Dr. Frederick Copeland had come to Millbrook in the spring of 1859. He was a 32-year-old man, tall and thin, with piercing dark eyes that appeared to look directly into a person's inner being. He had received his medical education at Harvard and worked for 2 years in Boston's hospitals before concluding that a country practice would be more suited to his nature. The local people accepted him warmly, especially since their previous doctor, an older man named Hutchins, had died suddenly from apoplexy, leaving them without medical attention for several months. Frederick had brought along his younger brother, Thomas, a kind-hearted 26-year-old, who was afflicted with what his family politely called spells, conditions we would now identify as serious epilepsy. Thomas's illness had become more severe over time, evolving from mild incidents to powerful convulsions that rendered him unconscious for hours on end. During a period when epilepsy was frequently seen as a symptom of character flaw or heavenly retribution, Frederick's loyalty to his brother was both moving and uncommon. The two brothers lived in a spacious colonial home on Elm Street, where the second floor operated as Frederick's medical office. Thomas, in his periods of clarity, helped his brother by keeping meticulous records of patients and managing the expanding inventory of medical supplies that Frederick had shipped from Boston and New York. The people of the town developed an affection for Thomas, observing his gentle way with children and his impressive understanding of medicinal plants, which he grew in a large garden at the back of their property. Frederick Copeland's medical practice thrived in his initial year in Millbrook, but people who knew him well started to see alarming shifts in his conduct as Thomas's health declined. The younger brother's seizures were growing more common and more intense, at times happening several times each day. Established treatments of the time, bleeding, induced vomiting, and the usual medicines, showed no positive effect at all. It was in the severe winter of 1860 that Frederick started his fall into what he would later call in his notes, essential investigation. Angry at the restrictions of mainstream medicine and determined to find a way to aid his brother, Frederick began looking into different therapies, writing to doctors in Europe, and reading old manuscripts about herbal cures. He was especially interested in the research of Dr. Claude Bernard in Paris, who had been testing plant alkaloids and their impacts on the nervous system. Frederick started to develop a theory that if specific plant substances could cause paralysis or loss of consciousness, maybe they could also stop the electrical disturbances in Thomas's brain that started his seizures. The cellar of the Copeland home was turned into an improvised laboratory. Frederick put in more oil lamps and obtained glass containers, measuring scales, and other apparatus needed for his work. He started with basic extracts from everyday plants: willow bark for reducing pain, digitalis from foxglove for heart issues, and different calming herbs. His first tests were performed on lab mice he got from an associate in Boston. Thomas, who knew about his brother's studies, willingly took part in what Frederick called closely monitored healing tests. The younger brother was ready to attempt any possible treatment that could ease the increasingly disabling seizures that were ruining his life. Frederick's diaries from this time show a systematic method that slowly twisted into a dangerous fixation. His first entries display precise recording of amounts, outcomes, and adverse effects. He observed that specific mixes of plant alkaloids could actually lessen how often Thomas's seizures happened, but the safe dosage range was small, and the boundary between healing and poisoning was extremely fine. As the winter became more severe, Frederick's tests turned more forceful. He started using more hazardous substances, extracts from belladonna, which could lead to visions and heart issues, and compounds from aconite, a plant so poisonous that minute quantities could be lethal. His reasoning, written down in handwriting that grew more and more disordered, was that Thomas's seizures were becoming so awful that any potential danger was acceptable if it could possibly lead to a cure. The change in Frederick's character became noticeable to his patients and neighbors. Where he had once been friendly and approachable, he turned reclusive and private. He began to decline invitations to social events and passed the majority of his spare time confined in his basement lab. Patients started to remark on his tired, unwell look and the noticeable trembling in his hands when he believed nobody was looking. February 27, 1861, started like numerous other days in the Copeland home, but it would conclude with a catastrophe that would torment Frederick for all his remaining years. Thomas had suffered an exceptionally powerful seizure that morning, one that left him disoriented and feeble for many hours afterwards. Frederick, motivated by despair and possibly impaired by his own tiredness, chose to test a new mixture he had been creating, a complicated blend of alkaloids that he thought might offer more extended relief. The formula was the result of months of labor. Frederick had been drawing out compounds from several poisonous plants, water hemlock, which he collected from the swamps near the town, deadly nightshade from his personal garden, and, most importantly, an unusual fungus that grew on rye grain, which he had acquired via a connection in Salem. This fungus, recognized for causing peculiar behaviors and occasionally death when eaten in tainted grain, held alkaloids that Frederick hypothesized could halt seizure activity. As night came, Thomas was struck by another serious episode. Frederick later wrote that seeing his brother's convulsions that evening filled him with such hopelessness that he cast aside his normal carefulness. Instead of giving the tiny trial amount he had intended, he administered to Thomas almost 3 times the quantity, believing that a more potent dose might at last yield the solution they so badly needed. The result was instant and frightful. Thomas's seizures ceased suddenly, but rather than the calm recovery Frederick had prayed for, his brother's body turned stiff, and his breathing grew so faint it was nearly undetectable. Thomas's heartbeat dropped to hardly noticeable levels. His skin turned cool and ashen, and his pupils became unresponsive and enlarged. Frederick worked desperately through the entire night, attempting every medical technique he knew to bring his brother back. He gave him stimulants, used heated cloths, and even tried the disputed method of electrical stimulation with a basic galvanic machine. Nothing had any effect. When morning arrived on February 28th, Thomas stayed in the same death-like condition, demonstrating no reaction to any outside stimulus. Confronted with the dreadful chance that he had murdered his brother, Frederick made a choice that would shape the remainder of his life. He could not face the legal outcomes of his testing. He also could not bear the disgrace that would ruin not just his career, but also the memory of his brother. In an instant of fear and extreme need, Frederick decided to announce that Thomas had died from normal causes. Frederick's choice to hide the truth demanded meticulous preparation and calm nerves, traits that his sorrow and remorse made hard to gather. He passed the morning of February 28th getting Thomas's body ready for what would look like a standard death from epilepsy, an ailment known to sometimes be fatal during extreme attacks. The initial problem was Thomas's physical look. The substances Frederick had given him had left his brother's skin with an abnormal whiteness and his arms and legs stiff in a manner that did not perfectly match typical rigor mortis. Frederick applied his medical understanding to manage these problems, using cosmetics to bring back some natural tone to Thomas's face and adjusting his limbs to reach a more usual posture. A more difficult issue was the matter of witnesses. In a small town such as Millbrook, deaths were public affairs, and it was anticipated that neighbors and acquaintances would visit to offer condolences and help. Frederick needed to manage who saw Thomas and at what time, making sure that nobody with medical training would get a chance to inspect the body carefully. Frederick's answer was to state that Thomas had passed away in the night during an especially violent seizure, and that the shock of the event had left the body in a state that made seeing it unwise. He stressed Thomas's lengthy fight with epilepsy and proposed that a calm funeral with a sealed coffin would be more suitable than exposing mourners to the upsetting proof of his brother's last moments. The townspeople took this explanation without doubt. Thomas's illness had been publicly known, and many had seen his seizures themselves. The notion that epilepsy might ultimately take his life appeared sad, but not unexpected. What did shock a few was Frederick's determination to manage all the funeral plans by himself, and his refusal of assistance offers from neighbors and the town church. Frederick's medical education was very useful in upholding the deceit. He could talk expertly about the bodily impacts of serious seizures and clarify why Thomas's body showed specific strange features. When the local pastor Reverend Isaiah Hartwell, showed surprise at how quickly Frederick wanted to move forward with the burial. Frederick clarified that mild weather was predicted and that swift burial would be more sanitary. The funeral was conducted on March 2nd, only 2 days after Thomas's reported death. Frederick had picked a basic pine casket and organized for burial in the town graveyard, choosing a plot in a secluded spot where Thomas had frequently walked when he was healthier. The ceremony had a large attendance, with almost half the town arriving to show their respect for the gentle young man who had tolerated so much pain. During the service, Frederick kept a composed attitude that many of the mourners found admirable. What they saw as quiet fortitude was truly Frederick's frantic attempt to stop himself from collapsing under the burden of his shame and fear. He gave a short funeral speech, commending Thomas's bravery in confronting his sickness and his generosity to others in spite of his own suffering. It was Reverend Hartwell who proposed the post-mortem photograph, a regular custom in 1861, when photography was still costly and many families possessed no other pictures of their dead loved ones. Frederick at first opposed the idea, frightened that a photo might in some way expose the truth about Thomas's state. But the Reverend's polite persistence and the community's expectations made saying no impossible without creating suspicion. The photographer, a traveling professional named Samuel Morrison, who came to Millbrook every month, arrived on the morning before the funeral. Morrison was skilled in post-mortem photography and handled his job with the seriousness and ability such events required. He had photographed many deceased people across Massachusetts and Vermont, creating methods for arranging bodies and using light to produce serene, respectful images. Frederick watched the photography session with poorly hidden nervousness. Morrison placed Thomas in the coffin with his hands crossed over his chest and set up the lighting to reduce shadows that could show the unnatural texture of his skin. The photographer remarked on how calm Thomas looked, saying that death had clearly come softly after so much hardship. The photographic procedure itself took almost an hour, as Morrison employed a large format camera that needed long exposure times. Frederick found himself staring at his brother's face during those extended minutes, looking for any indication of life, any sign that Thomas might still be living underneath the influence of the drugs. The motionlessness was absolute, however, and Frederick started to persuade himself that maybe Thomas was truly dead, that the substances had simply helped make his passing easier. When Morrison finished and started to pack his gear, he said he would develop the daguerreotype in his Boston studio and mail it to Frederick within the week. The photographer had captured what seemed to be a standard memorial picture, a young man lying quietly in death, encircled by flowers and illuminated by gentle natural light. Frederick paid Morrison his charge and watched the man depart from town, taking with him the photographic plates holding Thomas's image. As the carriage vanished down the main route to Boston, Frederick felt a combination of relief and anxiety. The photograph would act as proof of Thomas's peaceful death, but it also stood as a lasting document of Frederick's deception. The burial happened the next afternoon in a ritual that attracted almost the whole town. Frederick stood beside the grave as Reverend Hartwell talked about the puzzle of suffering and the promise of everlasting peace. As the first amounts of dirt landed on the coffin, Frederick shut his eyes and tried to convince himself that he was just burying his brother's physical shell, that Thomas's soul had already left. The dreadful finding. For 3 weeks following Thomas's burial, Frederick tried to go back to a normal life, but the heaviness of his secret turned each day into a challenge. His medical practice declined as he found it hard to focus on his patients' requirements. Sleep arrived only with the help of laudanum, and even then, His dreams were populated with pictures of Thomas crying out from under the ground. The daguerreotype came from Boston on March 21st, brought by the weekly mail coach, together with Frederick's normal mail and medical provisions. Morrison had done very good work. The picture was sharp and attractively arranged, displaying Thomas in tranquil rest, surrounded by spring blossoms. Frederick gazed at the photograph for a long while, noticing how realistic Thomas seemed, almost as though he were just sleeping. It was while looking at the photograph more carefully that Frederick saw something that caused his hands to shake. Near the edges of Thomas's fingernails, just visible in the daguerreotype, but undeniable once noticed, were what seemed to be scratches or markings. Frederick first wrote them off as flaws from the photographic method or shadows made by the lighting, but the longer he looked at the picture, the more certain he became that they were genuine. Propelled by a rising feeling of horror, Frederick got his magnifying lens and inspected the photograph under powerful lamplight. The marks were certainly there, and they seemed to be scratches in the coffin's soft wood where Thomas's hands lay. Even more alarming, there looked to be comparable marks on the satin lining close to Thomas's head, as if fingernails had scraped at the material. Frederick's medical understanding instantly proposed a frightening explanation. If Thomas had not been fully dead when buried, if the substances had only caused a death-like trance, then these marks could represent frantic struggles to get out of the coffin. The idea was so dreadful that Frederick at first would not accept it, but as he kept studying the photograph, the proof became impossible to disregard. Sleep was unattainable that night as Frederick struggled with the consequences of what he was seeing. If Thomas had been alive when buried, then Frederick was not merely responsible for medical negligence, but for murder through carelessness. Even worse, his brother might have endured inconceivable agony in those final moments, caught in blackness and incapable of calling for assistance. The next day, Frederick could tolerate the uncertainty no more. He made a decision that would trouble him for all his future days. He would dig up Thomas's body under the concealment of night and learn the truth completely. March 23rd, 1861, was a night without a moon, with heavy clouds that appeared to guarantee rain before sunrise. Frederick waited until long after midnight before going to the cemetery, bringing a shovel and a dark lantern that he kept covered to prevent discovery. The town was totally silent, with even the dogs seeming to feel that this was a night to remain inside. The cemetery was located on a hillside with a view of the town, its aged headstones and simple markers indicating the graves of Millbrook's inhabitants for almost 200 years. Thomas's grave was in the more recent part, where the soil was still loose and the grass had not yet fully grown. Frederick had selected the place partly for its seclusion, surrounded by mature oak trees that would hide his actions from any potential onlookers. The digging was more difficult than Frederick had expected. Even after only 3 weeks, the earth had compressed significantly, and the physical effort needed was draining for a man weakened by weeks of sleeplessness and lack of appetite. As he worked, Frederick found himself listening for any noise that might mean he was found. But the night stayed quiet, apart from the regular sound of his shovel cutting into the soil. It took almost 3 hours to get to the coffin, and by then Frederick was drenched in sweat despite the cool night air. When his shovel finally hit wood, the noise seemed unusually loud in the quiet. Frederick used his hands to brush away the last soil from the coffin lid, observing that the simple pine structure was already starting to show symptoms of dampness and rot. The instant of truth arrived when Frederick forced open the coffin lid with a crowbar he had brought for the task. He lifted his lantern to light up the inside, unsure of what he would discover, but dreading the worst. What he saw verified his most terrible fears and included information that would torture him for the remainder of his life. Thomas's body had moved from its position since the burial. Instead of lying calmly with his hands folded on his chest as he had been placed for the funeral, his arms were lifted toward the coffin lid, his fingers bent into claw shapes. The satin interior of the coffin was torn in several spots, clearly ripped by frantic fingernails. Most horrifying of all, Thomas's fingernails were covered in blood and damaged, with tiny wood fragments stuck under them. The proof was clear. Thomas had woken from his drug-caused trance while buried and had spent his last hours in frantic efforts to break free from his wooden cage. The scratches Frederick had seen in the photograph were only a small hint of the violent fight that had happened after burial. But Frederick's horror was not yet finished. As he inspected the coffin more closely by lantern light, he found an even more upsetting discovery. Scraped into the wooden sides of the coffin, apparently made with fingernails and possibly with the small metal fastener from Thomas's waistcoat, were letters and incomplete words. Most could not be read, but one message was clear enough to understand. Fred helped the sight of his brother's last desperate request threw Frederick into a condition of shock that left him shaking and sick. He had killed his brother not through one moment of medical mistake, but through a continued act of carelessness that had sentenced Thomas to the most dreadful death possible. In the days after his awful discovery, Frederick found he could not operate normally. The weight of his guilt was made heavier by increasing paranoia that someone might guess the truth about Thomas's death. He started to analyze his own actions and reasons, attempting to comprehend how he had fallen from a compassionate doctor to someone able of such dreadful negligence. It was during this time of self-reflection that Frederick found another thing that destroyed what was left of his sanity. While sorting his medical diaries and experimental records, he found notes of earlier patients who had died in similar situations, deaths he had previously credited to the natural course of their diseases. The first case that attracted his notice was Martha Henley, an older woman who had died the past autumn while under Frederick's care for what she described as nervous problems. Frederick had been treating her with experimental plant extracts like those he later used on Thomas. Martha had died suddenly during the night, and Frederick had assigned her death to heart failure caused by her old age and poor health. Looking over his notes on Martha's case, Frederick was horrified to understand that her symptoms before death were almost the same as Thomas's state after getting the experimental drugs. Martha had also shown the stiff limbs, hardly noticeable pulse, and death-like look that Frederick now knew could mean a drug-induced coma instead of real death. The records showed more troubling trends. During his 18 months in Millbrook, Frederick had treated at least 6 patients with his experimental mixtures, and 4 of them had died in conditions that now looked questionable. All had been people suffering from nervous ailments, epilepsy, or long-term pain, individuals desperate enough to attempt experimental therapies and remote enough that their deaths would not bring excessive examination. James Whitfield, a farmer who had experienced serious headaches after a fall from his barn, had died after getting Frederick's plant-based treatments for pain relief. The death had been assigned to problems from his head injury, but Frederick's notes showed that James had displayed the same symptoms as Thomas before dying. Young Sarah Mills, only 16 years old, had suffered from hysteria and fits that some townsfolk attributed to demonic control. Her family had brought her to Frederick as a final option, and she had died after 3 weeks of treatment with Frederick's experimental mixtures. Her death had been assigned to the seriousness of her condition, but Frederick now saw the familiar sequence of symptoms. Most disturbing of all was the situation of Timothy Watson, a Civil War veteran who had returned to Millbrook with what we would now identify as what was then named soldier's heart. Signs of mental trauma from combat. Timothy had suffered from nightmares, violent episodes, and times of deep depression that made ordinary life impossible. Frederick had treated him with experimental drugs meant to quiet his mind, and Timothy had died suddenly after seeming to get better. As Frederick examined these cases with his new knowledge of what his mixtures could do, he realized he might have buried alive not only his brother, but possibly several other people. The idea that other innocent victims might have suffered Thomas's destiny sent Frederick into a whirlwind of guilt and terror that made normal life impossible. The understanding that he might have performed multiple murders changed Frederick's guilt into something close to insanity. He started to feel symptoms that copied those of his former patient, Timothy Watson: nightmares, paranoid false beliefs, and a growing trouble telling the difference between reality and the horrific situations his mind created. Frederick's medical practice fell apart as he became unable to treat patients without being overpowered by visions of their potential suffering. Every medicine he prescribed, every treatment he suggested, seemed to hold the risk of causing the same terrible fate he had brought upon Thomas and possibly others. The people of Millbrook started to notice Frederick's decline. Patients grumbled that he seemed preoccupied and anxious during checkups, often stopping in the middle of a sentence to gaze out the window or ask random questions about their families and burial wishes. His look became messy, and he developed a nervous routine of continuously washing his hands, as if trying to clean himself of unseen blood. Frederick's paranoia expanded to include the whole town. He became sure that people were observing him, waiting for proof of his crimes. Every discussion seemed to contain hidden intentions. Every look implied doubt. When children played in the cemetery near Thomas's grave, Frederick was certain they were searching for signs of interference. When Reverend Hartwell inquired about his health during Sunday services, Frederick heard charges in the minister's worried words. The final collapse came in early June, when Frederick got a visit from Dr. Samuel Hayes of the Boston Medical Society. Hayes had come to Millbrook to talk about Frederick's request for membership in the society, a professional distinction that would have greatly helped his career. During their conversation, Hayes noted his curiosity about Frederick's studies into plant-based treatments for nervous disorders. Frederick's response to this harmless question was so intense that it worried his guest. He became upset and protective, stating that his research had been only theoretical and that he had never tested on human subjects. When Hayes asked for details about Frederick's published articles on alkaloid extracts, Frederick suddenly finished the meeting and requested his guest to leave at once. That night, Frederick made his last choice. He could no longer carry the weight of his crimes, and he could not go on living with the knowledge that other families might have lost loved ones to his irresponsible testing. He spent the whole night composing a detailed confession that described not only Thomas's death, but also his worries about the other patients who had died under his care. Just when we believed we had seen everything, the terror in Millbrook grows stronger. If this story is making you shiver, share this video with a friend who enjoys dark mysteries. Press that like button to help our content. And remember to subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. Let's find out together what occurs next in Frederick's frightening confession. Frederick's confession took up almost 30 pages of neat handwriting, describing not just the exact situations of each suspicious death, but also his techniques for hiding the proof and his growing awareness of what he had done. The paper showed a methodical design of testing that had made the whole town of Millbrook into Frederick's unaware laboratory. The confession explained how Frederick had cautiously chosen his victims from the most defenseless members of the community, those suffering from conditions that were poorly comprehended and for which standard medicine provided little hope. These patients were often desperate enough to attempt experimental treatments and socially separated enough that their deaths would not cause detailed investigation. Frederick's methods had become more advanced over time. He had learned to schedule his experimental treatments to match times when his patients' conditions were already worsening, making sudden death seem like a natural development of their illnesses. He had also become adept at copying the symptoms of different diseases, using his medical knowledge to make drug-caused deaths look like the result of heart failure, stroke, or problems from existing conditions. The confession showed that Frederick had kept detailed notes on all his tests, including careful observations of the impacts of different plant compounds and dosage amounts. These notes were concealed in a secret space behind a bookcase in his study, together with samples of the various alkaloids he had taken out and purifying. Most chilling of all, the confession included Frederick's increasing suspicion that some of his earlier victims might also have been buried alive. He described slight signs he had seen during the preparation of bodies for burial, fingernail harm that he had credited to the final movements of death, small changes in body position between the time of death and funeral preparation, and little rips in burial clothes that might have shown struggle. After finishing his confession, Frederick faced a decision between turning himself in to the authorities and running away. The possibility of a trial and execution scared him, but just as frightening was the idea of the scandal that would overwhelm not only him, but also the innocent townspeople who had trusted him. The families of his victims would have to live with the knowledge that their loved ones had died horrible deaths because of Frederick's negligence. Frederick chose to flee, but not before taking actions to make sure the truth would finally be found. He sealed his confession together with his experimental notes and the condemning daguerreotype of Thomas in a metal box, which he hid behind a fake wall in the basement of his house. He left mysterious hints about where this evidence was located in letters to the Boston Medical Society and to Reverend Hartwell, knowing that eventually someone would solve the mystery. On the night of June 15, 1861, Frederick Copeland vanished from Millbrook, taking only a small bag of personal items and enough cash to support him for a few weeks. He left behind a short note claiming that grief over Thomas's death had made it impossible for him to continue practicing medicine in the town where his brother had died. Frederick's sudden disappearance caused a stir in Millbrook, especially coming so soon after the tragedy of Thomas's death. The townspeople had trouble understanding how a man who had seemed so dedicated to his brother could leave the practice and community he had worked so hard to establish. Rumors spread about gambling debts, romantic affairs, and even suggestions that Frederick had been secretly enlisted for military service. The house on Elm Street remained empty for several months while the town tried to find Frederick or his legal representatives. Finally, the property was taken for unpaid taxes and sold to a family from Boston who intended to use it as a summer home. It was during the remodeling of the basement that workers found Frederick's hidden laboratory and the sealed box holding his confession. The discovery of Frederick's confession sent shockwaves through both Millbrook and the wider medical community. The detailed descriptions of his experiments and the evidence of multiple possible murders led to the digging up of several bodies from the town cemetery. The investigation confirmed Frederick's worst fears. Physical evidence indicated that at least 3 of his former patients had indeed been buried alive. Martha Henley's remains showed the same signs of frantic struggle that had been found in Thomas's coffin. Her fingernails were broken and bloody, and the inside of her coffin had scratches and tears that showed desperate attempts to escape. The discovery caused a more complete examination of other suspicious deaths, showing a pattern of medical murder that went back to Frederick's earliest days in Millbrook. The investigation also uncovered Frederick's communication with colleagues in other cities, showing that his experimental work was part of a larger network of doctors who were testing the limits of medical ethics in their search for breakthrough treatments. Several other physicians were looked into for similar practices, though none were found to have caused as many deaths as Frederick. The scandal effectively finished the careers of several prominent doctors who had been connected to Frederick's research, including Dr. Samuel Hayes, who had accidentally started Frederick's final collapse through his innocent questions about experimental treatments. The Boston Medical Society introduced new ethical rules for medical research and set up procedures for watching doctors who worked with experimental drugs. The search for Frederick Copeland became one of the most widespread criminal investigations in Massachusetts history, involving local police, federal marshals, and even Pinkerton detectives hired by the families of his victims. The search was made difficult by the ongoing Civil War, which offered many chances for a fugitive to take on a new identity and disappear into the disorder of military recruitment and population movement. First searches concentrated on the major cities where Frederick might have contacts: Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Investigators found that Frederick had taken out large amounts of money from his bank accounts in the weeks before his disappearance, suggesting that his escape had been planned ahead of time. They also found proof that he had been buying supplies and equipment that would be helpful for starting a new medical practice under a false name. The search finally spread across the whole continent as reported sightings came in from as far away as California and Oregon Territory. A man matching Frederick's description had been seen working as a doctor in a mining camp near Sacramento. But by the time investigators got there, he had vanished again. Another promising clue took detectives to a field hospital in Virginia, where a doctor with similar physical features had been treating injured soldiers. But this also turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. What made the search especially hard was Frederick's medical training, which would let him start a practice almost anywhere and quickly gain the trust and safety of local communities. Unlike most fugitives who had to turn to low-level work or criminal activities that would reveal them to detection, Frederick could mix smoothly into respectable society by simply introducing himself as a doctor wanting to help others. The investigation did show some disturbing patterns that suggested Frederick might be continuing his experimental work in his new location. Reports came in from several frontier towns of mysterious deaths among patients treated by traveling doctors who matched Frederick's description. These cases shared the same features as the Millbrook murders: vulnerable patients suffering from poorly understood conditions who died suddenly after receiving experimental treatments. As the years went by and the trail became cold, public interest in the case started to fade. The Civil War controlled national attention, and the resources available for chasing a single fugitive became more and more limited. By 1865, the active search for Frederick Copeland had been mostly given up, though his name stayed on wanted lists and rewards were still offered for information leading to his capture. The last proof. The most important development in understanding the full extent of Frederick's crimes came in 1867, when renovation work at a church in Springfield, Massachusetts, uncovered a collection of documents that had apparently been hidden by Frederick during his escape. The papers included more experimental notes, letters to other doctors involved in similar research, and, most shocking of all, photographs of other victims that showed the same clear signs of struggle that had been visible in Thomas's post-mortem portrait. These photographs showed that Frederick had been recording his experiments much more thoroughly than his Millbrook confession had shown. The images displayed patients in different stages of drug-induced comas, some clearly still alive, even though appearing dead. others showing evidence of having woken up during burial preparation. The photos came with detailed notes describing the effects of different alkaloid combinations and dosage levels. The discovery of these extra photographs led to a new series of investigations across New England as authorities tried to identify the victims and decide whether their deaths had been properly looked into at the time. Several cases that had been assigned to natural causes were reopened, and more exhumations were ordered based on the evidence found in Frederick's hidden archive. The investigation showed that Frederick's network of experimental doctors was much larger than first thought. Physicians in at least 6 different states had been writing to Frederick about alkaloid research, sharing information about their own experiments and comparing results. Some of these doctors had also disappeared around the same time as Frederick, suggesting that the exposure of the Millbrook murders had caused a wider breakdown of the experimental network. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery that Frederick's research had been partly successful. His notes indicated that some of his experimental mixtures had actually shown potential for treating epilepsy and other nervous disorders. But his total disregard for patient safety had turned possibly helpful research into a series of horrific murders. The knowledge that his work might have led to genuine medical progress made his crime seem even more tragic and pointless. The Copeland case had widespread effects on American medicine and society that went far beyond the immediate horror of the murders themselves. The revelation that a respected doctor could methodically murder his patients while keeping the appearance of caring treatment broke public trust in the medical profession and led to major changes in medical education and practice. Medical schools across the country started new required classes in medical ethics, and professional organizations created codes of behavior that clearly banned human experimentation without informed consent. These changes represented some of the first attempts to control medical research and protect patients from misuse. The psychological effect on the community of Millbrook was deep and long-lasting. Many residents reported having nightmares about being buried alive, and several families decided to have their dead relatives cremated instead of buried. Despite strong religious objections to the practice, the town cemetery, once a calm place for thought and memory, became a source of fear and suspicion as people wondered which graves might hold evidence of Frederick's crimes. The case also added to growing public interest in preventing premature burial, a fear that had existed in society but which Frederick's crimes had made terrifyingly real. Inventors started creating safety coffins fitted with bells, speaking tubes, and escape systems that would let someone mistakenly buried alive signal for help or free themselves. The Copeland murders became the subject of many newspaper articles, books, and even theater shows throughout the late 19th century. Each retelling seemed to add new horrific details or speculative elements, changing Frederick from a specific historical person into a symbol of medical evil and uncontrolled scientific ambition. Religious leaders used the case as proof of the dangers of putting too much faith in human knowledge and scientific advancement over divine will. The idea that a doctor, someone pledged to save life, could become a systematic killer seemed to support conservative warnings about the moral risks of modern medicine and experimental science. Despite decades of investigation and many reported sightings, Frederick Copeland was never definitely found or captured. The last reliable report placed him in the Dakota Territory in 1871, where a doctor matching his description had been treating settlers and soldiers at a remote frontier post. By the time investigators reached the location, however, the mysterious doctor had moved on, leaving behind only thankful patients and vague stories about his past. Some investigators thought that Frederick had died during his years as a fugitive, possibly killed by hostile Native Americans, disease, or the tough conditions of frontier life. Others believed that he had successfully created a new identity and continued practicing medicine under a different name, perhaps in a remote area where his past would never be discovered. The most disturbing theory, supported by a pattern of suspicious deaths that seemed to follow Frederick's path across the continent, was that he had continued his experimental work throughout his fugitive years. Reports of mysterious deaths among patients treated by traveling doctors created a trail of horror that stretched from Massachusetts to California, suggesting that Frederick's desire for human experimentation had not been satisfied by his crimes in Millbrook. One especially convincing account came from a mining camp in Colorado, where a doctor calling himself Francis Coleman had treated several miners for various illnesses in 1869. 3 of his patients had died in circumstances very similar to the Millbrook murders: sudden deaths following experimental treatments, quick burial, and later evidence suggesting possible premature burial. The doctor had disappeared right after the 3rd death, taking with him detailed medical notes and a collection of plant samples. Another credible sighting happened in Oregon Territory in 1873, where a doctor named Frederick Collins had started a practice in a small farming community. Local records showed that Collins had an unusual interest in treating patients with nervous disorders and epilepsy using plant-based remedies that he claimed to have created himself. When territorial authorities arrived to look into reports of suspicious deaths, they found that Collins had vanished, leaving behind a laboratory full of exotic plant extracts and detailed experimental notes. In 1875, 14 years after Thomas Copeland's death, a revelation appeared that added one more layer of horror to the already nightmarish case. Samuel Morrison, the traveling photographer who had taken Thomas's post-mortem portrait, came forward with information that he had kept secret since the day of the photography session. Morrison revealed that during the long exposure needed for the daguerreotype, he had noticed slight movements in Thomas's face and hands that had concerned him at the time. The movements were so small that Morrison had assigned them to natural settling of the body, or maybe shadows created by the flickering oil lamps used for light. However, the photographer's trained eye had seen what seemed to be very shallow breathing and occasional slight muscle contractions. Morrison had told Frederick about his observations right after finishing the photograph, voicing worry that perhaps Thomas was not really dead, but only in some kind of deep unconsciousness. Frederick had dismissed these concerns, explaining that such movements were common in recently dead individuals and resulted from the gradual cooling of the body and settling of bodily fluids. The photographer had accepted Frederick's explanation at the time, trusting the doctor's medical knowledge over his own untrained observations. However, when news of Frederick's crimes became public, Morrison realized that his suspicions had been correct and that he might have been the last person who could have saved Thomas Copeland's life. Morrison's revelation was especially devastating because it showed that Thomas's condition had been obvious enough for a non-medical observer to see, meaning that Frederick must have been completely aware that his brother was still alive when he arranged for the burial. This changed the case from medical negligence into intentional murder, suggesting that Frederick had knowingly condemned his brother to death to hide his experimental crimes. The photographer's testimony also raised disturbing questions about the other post-mortem photographs that Frederick had commissioned for his experimental victims. Morrison's records showed that he had photographed at least 3 other patients of Frederick's who had died in similar circumstances, and in each case he had noticed the same slight signs of life that he had seen in Thomas. The revelation about Morrison's observations sent the community of Millbrook into a state of near panic that continued for years after Frederick's disappearance. Residents became obsessed with the fear of premature burial, and several families demanded that recently buried relatives be dug up for examination. The town cemetery became a place of constant activity as investigations continued and families looked for reassurance about their loved ones. The psychological impact on the townspeople was profound and long-lasting. Many residents reported being unable to sleep, haunted by thoughts of their dead relatives, possibly suffering the same fate as Thomas Copeland. Some families took extreme measures, such as delaying burials for long periods or insisting on complicated procedures to confirm death before burial. The local doctor, Dr. William Brennan, who had taken over Frederick's practice, found himself overwhelmed not only with medical cases, but also with requests from anxious residents for reassurance about deaths that had happened months or even years earlier. Dr. Brennan was forced to create new rules for confirming death, including extended observation periods and multiple examinations before declaring a patient deceased. The fear of premature burial became so widespread that it started to affect the living as well as worries about the dead. Several residents developed what we would now identify as panic disorders, becoming convinced that they themselves might fall victim to the kind of death-like trance that had taken Thomas and others. This fear led to an outbreak of hypochondria and anxiety that further strained the community's psychological resources. The local church, led by Reverend Hartwell, tried to provide spiritual comfort and a reasonable view on the crisis, but even religious faith seemed inadequate to address the horror of what had been found. Sunday sermons that once focused on salvation and eternal life now dealt with questions about suffering, evil, and the failure of trusted institutions to protect the innocent. The exposure of Frederick Copeland's crimes sent shockwaves through the American medical establishment that echoed for decades. Medical journals published detailed analyses of the case, trying to understand how a properly trained doctor could fall into such systematic evil and what protections could prevent similar tragedies in the future. The Boston Medical Society, which had unknowingly been in communication with Frederick about his research, started a comprehensive investigation into experimental medical practices throughout New England. The investigation showed that Frederick's crimes were part of a larger pattern of unethical experimentation that had been mostly hidden from public view and professional oversight. Several prominent doctors were found to have been doing similar research using human subjects without proper consent or safety measures, and while none were found to have committed murders on the scale of Frederick's crimes, the investigation showed a troubling disregard for patient welfare among researchers who put scientific advancement before human safety. The scandal led to the creation of new professional standards for medical research and practice. Medical schools started required courses in medical ethics, and professional organizations developed codes of conduct that clearly prohibited human experimentation without informed consent. These reforms represented some of the earliest efforts to regulate medical research and protect patients from exploitation. The case also started wider debates about the role of science in society and the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition. Critics argued that the pursuit of medical knowledge had become separated from moral considerations, creating situations where researchers could treat human beings as experimental subjects rather than individuals deserving of care and respect. As news of the Copeland case spread beyond America's borders, it caused investigations into similar practices in other countries. European medical authorities started reviews of experimental research programs, especially those involving alkaloid compounds and treatments for nervous disorders. Several cases of suspicious deaths were identified that shared characteristics with Frederick's murders. The international scope of the investigation showed that Frederick had been part of a network of researchers that extended across the Atlantic. Letters found in his hidden archives included correspondence from doctors in London, Paris, and Vienna, who were doing similar experiments with plant-based compounds. Some of these foreign colleagues had also disappeared around the time that Frederick's crimes were exposed, suggesting that the scandal had caused a wider collapse of the experimental network. British authorities identified at least 2 cases in London where patients treated with experimental alkaloids had died in circumstances similar to the Millbrook murders. French investigators found evidence of a research program in Paris that had resulted in several unexplained deaths among patients suffering from epilepsy and other nervous conditions. These discoveries suggested that Frederick's crimes were part of a much larger pattern of medical murder that had been happening throughout the Western world. The international investigation also showed the extent to which unregulated medical research had been taking advantage of vulnerable populations. Patients suffering from poorly understood conditions like epilepsy, hysteria, and what was then called neurasthenia had been seen as ideal subjects for experimental treatments because their conditions were often considered hopeless by conventional medicine. In 1889, 28 years after Frederick Copeland's disappearance, a final piece of evidence appeared that provided both closure and new mysteries. A package arrived at the Boston Medical Society with no return address, containing a daguerreotype and a short note written in handwriting that experts confirmed belonged to Frederick. The photograph showed an old man lying in what seemed to be a simple wooden coffin, placed in the same way as Thomas Copeland's post-mortem portrait. The man's face was thin and worn, suggesting a life of difficulty, but his features were recognizably those of Frederick Copeland, aged by nearly 30 years of life as a fugitive. The note that came with it was brief but chilling. The final subject of my research. May God have mercy on my soul, and may my victims find peace in death that they were denied in life. The experiments are complete. The note was dated simply winter 1889, with no location given. Medical experts who looked at the photograph noted the same slight signs that Samuel Morison had seen in Thomas's portrait decades earlier, evidence suggesting that the subject might not have been completely dead when the photograph was taken. The implications were horrifying. Frederick appeared to have performed his final experiment on himself, possibly causing the same death-like trance that had doomed his brother and other victims. The package also contained a small bottle of crystalline powder and detailed notes describing its makeup and effects. Analysis showed that Frederick had refined his alkaloid compounds over the decades, developing what seemed to be a more exact formula for causing reversible death-like states. The notes suggested that he had finally achieved the scientific breakthrough he had been looking for, but at the cost of countless lives and his own sanity. The Frederick Copeland case became one of the most infamous medical crimes in American history, setting examples for medical ethics and patient protection that continue to affect healthcare practice today. The case demonstrated the importance of oversight and regulation in medical research, especially when dealing with experimental treatments and vulnerable patient populations. The horror of Thomas Copeland's death and the systematic nature of Frederick's crimes captured the public imagination in ways that influenced popular culture for generations. The case inspired many works of fiction, from Gothic novels to early horror films, and established many of the themes that continue to appear in medical horror stories today. Perhaps most importantly, the case served as a catalyst for the development of modern medical ethics and patient rights. The changes put in place in response to Frederick's crimes laid the foundation for the informed consent procedures, research oversight committees, and patient advocacy protections that are now standard practice in medical care. The town of Millbrook eventually recovered from the trauma of Frederick's crimes, but the case left permanent changes in the community's character. The The cemetery where Thomas and Frederick's other victims were buried became a place of pilgrimage for those interested in medical history and the dark side of scientific progress. A memorial built in 1901 honors the victims and acts as a reminder of the importance of maintaining ethical standards in medical practice. This mystery shows us how the pursuit of knowledge, when separated from compassion and ethical limits, can change healers into monsters and turn scientific progress into tools of horror. The Copeland case reminds us that medical advancement must always be balanced with respect for human dignity and the basic principle that patients must be protected, not exploited by those trusted with their care. What are your thoughts on this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about Frederick Copeland's fate? Or do you think there are still secrets hidden in the archives of medical history? Leave your comment below and share your ideas about what really happened to the doctor who photographed death before it arrived. If you like this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark mysteries. We'll see you in the next video.